Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, wherever you are, and welcome to the online discourse of climate reparation for climate justice, devolving its benefits to the indigenous and minority rights, a conversation with Dorothy Guerrero. Thank you so much, Ms. Guerrero, for squeezing out for your precious time and providing us with your valuable time to the SARIM. I'm your host Furqan Ahmed. I'm working as a senior research associate. I have the honor of moderating today's session. A short introduction about our guest today, because the interview is designed in a way that is starting with her own introduction. So, Ms. Guerrero is a head of policy and advocacy of Global Justice Now. She is also a renowned author and organizer. So, since it is our first interaction with Ms. Guerrero, I will be introducing what SARIM does. So, South Asia Research Institute for Minorities is an organization having the vision of defending the rights of minorities of South Asia. The institute aims towards highlighting the plight and victimization faced by marginalized minority communities. SARIM, through a regularly updated database publications, of annual reports, international conferences, seminars, and webinars with field experts and researchers promote the culture of constructive dialogue to highlight the issues, vulnerabilities faced by minority communities, and to raise voice to safeguard their rights, especially within the South Asian countries. So, as I said, thank you so much, Ms. Guerrero, for providing us your time. So, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and your background to begin with?
Yeah, thank you, Furkan. It's a pleasure to join you today in this interview series that you are doing. So, my name is Dorothy Guerrero with that name. You can, I think, guess I'm from the Philippines originally. At the moment, I'm based in the UK and working as head of policy and advocacy with Global Justice Now. We are a social justice organization based in London and Edinburgh, and we work with many countries, movements, progressive groups in the global south as well, in joint campaigning for issues that has to do with how do we change the global rule on finance, on trade, on climate, and then also other issues that are important here, like migration in the UK. I have been working for more than 30 years, working in social movements and also in the last 2 decades as a non-government staff of organizations doing writing, analysis, and research, and then also public education or political education to make key issues that I think are important, better understood and widely understood.
Thank you so much for providing us your introduction and about the organization that you're working with. So, I'll be asking you a question that is that would be revolving around the theme. So, what is the concept of climate reparations, and how does it relate to climate justice?
But climate reparation, or maybe 2 steps back, we now have, and rightly so, a global consensus that climate change is an important global issue that needs global cooperation and solidarity. And that cooperation and solidarity should be based, accepted, and acknowledged by polluters, especially also by rich countries. If we look at this short definition that it is the center of the demand for climate justice, it is actually a narrative shift that still needs a global consensus because not many people even know there is such a concept as climate reparations, and also many would associate the term reparation with very legal. It's a very legal concept, and which needs exploring as well. And it's important in terms of how do we bring it down, or break it down. Sorry, in very understandable concept that everyone can see. Yes, that applies to me as a woman, as an indigenous person, as a community indigenous person. So this narrative shift actually is important before or at the same time while we are working for just transition, which is also steps that needs to simultaneously happen as we address the complex problem of climate change. Climate reparations also constitute an indispensable part of an urgent effort of solidarity to achieve climate justice. In the UN climate talks, of course the negotiation and the debates revolves around the issue of climate finance, which is part of reparation. So don't get me wrong on that. It is part of reparation, but the demand is also, as I mentioned, based on climate justice and equity, because we have to acknowledge as well that when we talk about climate change, we are talking here about the need for first the radical emission by the historic and huge polluters to reduce their emission based on their responsibility, because since 1850, countries like here in the UK had started their industrial revolution, has started emitting greenhouse gases. So there is a difference between those who have emitted a lot of greenhouse gases and those who are just starting to industrialize now and still needed that space to grow their economy and at the same time achieve their basic needs. So there is that one argument. It is part of the important argument. So the need to build a consensus is because this was blocked in the UN climate talks when the southern countries, supported by movements from various countries, but also especially from southern countries, the rich countries in the climate talks don't want to discuss it, don't want to acknowledge reparations, of course, because that would mean if you go into that terrain, that means they will be legally obligated to pay. And so it went on a circuitous route since the start of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, when they are still negotiating for the final documents in 1991. Actually, the small island developing countries already said that there are slow onset of climate change. We know that there will be sea level rise. And if that happens, many of the countries, vulnerable countries like the small island developing states, or countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, big capital cities like Manila, Jakarta, are all on the sea levels. So if there will be a rise in the sea levels, then those cities will disappear. Those territories will disappear. So there is a need to have a sort of compensation because also it is now a known fact that when we talk about climate change, not everyone is guilty. Although it's a global problem that must be addressed globally, it is equally important to understand that not everyone is guilty on the same level or have emitted the same emission globally. So there is that understanding that rich countries, have been emitting many years before developing countries started. So not just on the domestic use of people, but also through historical factors as well, like colonization. So historically, the issue of reparations legally actually were raised, for example, by the Black communities in the U.S. calling for the reparations owed to them by getting them in the U.S. against their agreement that they were enslaved through the slave trade, and they were scattered in different parts of the world because of that act of slavery and making them as a commodity, like a trade. That's why if I mentioned the slave trade. So the Black communities in the U.S. mentioned that there must be a reparation for what was done to us. And when we also talk of reparations, There is a very clear definition in the United Nations, the basic principles of reparations or guidelines for right remedy and reparation. First, there must be restitution. So whenever possible, the victims must be restored to the original situation. In it, well, part of loss and damage is in that argument that in climate you have loss and damage. So how do you restore our environment to the form where it is not far from what we have now? There must be compensation, and it's not just monetary compensation, but there should be compensation. Of course, there is financial aspect to it. So there must be financial compensation that must be provided to us at the same time economically assess the damage. Third, there should be rehabilitation. It should include like psychological, medical, and ecological rehabilitation, and there should be a satisfaction factor. So that would include measures wherein you also cease or to do what created the damage. In the history, for example, of the Holocaust, Germany is doing that by means of doing Holocaust education to in the education in their education process. Any primary school kids learn about Holocaust, and there were measures in many countries to include climate change in the curriculum, so that children will understand all these multifaceted issues on climate change. And what is more important, the fifth element is a guarantee of non-repetition. So when we say that, that means if there is that acknowledgement who created climate change, what institutions are enabling the denialism of climate change, and what are the corporations that are guilty of spreading and also fast tracking climate change and don't want to change. So it will be essential that there it is understood that there will be that element of non-repetition. That's why part of many campaigns of many social movement is that we should stop and keep the oil in the soil, for example, because we know fossil fuels, especially oil extraction, created climate change.
Thank you so much. You've given us the historic perspective as well. You've provided detailed insight about what has been happening in the past, like in terms of carbon emission, other prospect that basically exhibit global warming. And you've also provided us the detailed information about some different sort of reparation that took place in different countries. So thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, moving forward, I would also would like to add as well that there has to be a sociological reparation as well, if I'm not mistaken. So I mean, it has to be like that. So I'll be asking you a question about. I mean, you talked about the history and the and its perspective, and why is reparations important? You know, the social moments, researchers, and more. Some governments are still building consensus on it. It was a fact blocked in the UN climate talks, similar to what happened, you know, with loss and damage before the loss and damage was agreed last year.
Oh yeah, because in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed by I think from the start 196 countries, it's a legally binding document. Countries must be obligated to follow what is in the agreement. In terms of restitution in terms of reparations, it is in practical and legal levels. There must be an attribution or acknowledgement of of these historical damages. Many rich countries in the talks don't do wanted to avoid the blame game, because when blame is legally put towards a country or entity, then that would mean they will be obligated to pay for reparation. And as movements were saying, high income, high emitting countries have benefited themselves while harming low income, low emitting countries. So there's an emphasis on the inequities embedded in the causes and consequences of historical warming. The countries that are vulnerable, if you look at the list of the climate vulnerable countries, you will see that most of them are also the colonized countries. And I think an important development last year with the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, for the first time after 30 years of its existence, the IPCC recognized that the colonialism is an important factor in the creation of climate change. That was a first because in the past, rich countries don't want to acknowledge that colonialism and climate change are go together. That there is that link between colonization and climate change. But now that you have this important recognition coming to official documents, like the IPCC, this concept, definition, and precedents are important in any international problem solving processes and mechanisms. And another reason why it is important, as I mentioned in those elements recognized in the UN on the how do you know that reparations is being done, is that so that first and foremost there is an acknowledgement that damage is done. And as what you mentioned in the Conference of Parties in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for 3 decades, the rich countries don't want to acknowledge that the actions of the rich impact the majority of the poor. So we're talking here of 3.5 billion of the population that do not contribute to, or with very, very little contribution to climate change, but at the same time, they are on the sharp edge of it. Like Pakistan, for example, the flooding last year, your government in the talks mentioned that Pakistan estimated the losses of the Pakistan flood is around $40 billion from the flooding. So that includes the destroyed infrastructure, that includes the lost livelihood, that includes the number of animals that are important to the livelihood of farmers that died. So where will Pakistan get the 40 billion to recover from the flooding? So in the back to the negotiation, when developing countries or southern countries mentioned that there should be a separate mechanism and a new pillar on climate finance, which is loss and damage, so that these kinds of climate catastrophe and the impacts of such kind of catastrophe, there will be some part where countries can say, okay, we will, after assessing our damages, these are the losses, and therefore they can get from that finance facility. So the Sharm el Sheikh results doesn't include yet those kinds of questions: who can apply, how much each countries will put in. Those were not yet resolved, but it is important already that there is that agreement that there should be a loss and damage finance that needs to be put together by countries.
Absolutely.
And not to mention displacement as well, because displacement is also impacts one of the impacts when there is a climate linked catastrophe.
Absolutely. And yeah, the Pakistani government is basically doing its best what it could do, right? What it can do in terms of, recuperate the damage that took place last year due to the floodings. And you also talked about the blame game as well. And it has to be, shared responsibility in terms of, it has to be shared responsibility of loss and damage as well, right? In terms of what the rich countries have been doing, right? I'm not taking any names as right now. Everybody knows who's responsible behind this catastrophe, or the behind producing such ways of producing such climate damage as well. So yeah, provided us your detailed input on this issue. So I mean, how it is linked with loss and damage. The recently agreed climate finance mechanism in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. How do you relate it with this loss and damage?
Mm. Yes. Loss and damage is actually seen by us climate campaigners as a paradigm shift as well, because for the first 2 decades of the talks, the emphasis is on climate mitigation and on climate adaptation. So loss and damage is the third pillar of that. And well, climate loss, I mean, the loss and damage is an important factor of reparation, but it's not equivalent to reparations. Because as I mentioned, there are many elements in people that needed to migrate, for example, for climate change. Then it's part of you can say, present and future damage for created by climate change. But with the loss and damage, it is an element or a pillar in the climate finance mechanisms wherein there would be an element of quantifying what would be the slow onset climate impacts, and also what are the immediate climate impacts. Like the question of the flooding in Pakistan, you have an immediate impact, loss of livelihood, dead cattle, people that needs to seek to the higher ground, or migration, be it temporary or permanent. But then globally, you also have the slow onset, like sea level rise. So with loss and damage, then it is clear that there is an acknowledgement that due to climate change, some impacts may be forever gone, like species extinction. If a certain species of plant and animal disappear due to climate change, it will be very, very difficult or next to impossible to bring them back. And it is already happening in the negotiation COP15 on biodiversity. That was the center of their discussion. There is an acknowledgement that plants and animal species are disappearing and getting extinct. Then there's also the damage. So the term loss and damage, actually, there was also a battle in the negotiation, because way back a decade ago, many rich countries just wanted to equal or equate loss and damage to some sort of like insurance mechanism. But the thing is, insurance work for rich countries. Like when flooding happened in Germany, for this historic flooding in Germany, when that happened, almost all the houses were insured. But in countries like the Philippines or Pakistan, people would first secure their daily meals, and many of their concern will, insurance will be far beyond from that thinking. And then also many of the loss and damages impacts would be difficult to insure. How will you insure a whole island disappearing or a whole country disappearing? Like in the case of those islands in the Pacific.
Absolutely. I would like to second your thought in terms of awareness regarding the insurance. We in Pakistan don't even know what the insurance is. I mean, I'm talking about with the perspective of layman, because we don't know what our basic rights are. You know, you talked about an idea or the example that is far behind or far ahead of us in terms of, because Pakistan population is basically heavily dependent on its rural areas as well, because people in rural areas mostly are not educated or not well informed, so they are the ones who basically face a lot of issues. So I have a follow-up questions with regards to this as well. So I'll be ending this session right now. I have 5 minutes. Can we finish this up within the 5 minutes? Our next question, or do I need to restart? It's up to you.
Let's try.
Okay. So
Yeah, you just
okay. So how can we address the historical and systematic injustices faced by indigenous and minority communities in relation to the climate change?
yeah. That is a very important issue because when you mention that in many developing countries, the population uh, there's a challenge on the education. Um, reparations and also this idea of climate justice and equity. This also pertains to both the moral and legal obligation. So people may not be educated and don't know the law, but they know when their house was flooded or their furnitures and their pets died or something like that, or their pigs and cows were carried by flood water. So they know that they have both financial, economic, and at the same time there was some moral damage. So by attributing the global cause of climate change, then people will also know, okay, it is happening to my country or in my village, but there are factors out there outside my village, outside my country that is causing it, like fossil fuel companies. And for that, our organization, Global Justice Now, actually wanted to put a new narrative in the debate as well, because in the UN negotiation, the focus are on countries. So how will it's a north and rich debate, north or rich country and poor country debate. But at the same time, we're forgetting that climate change was also caused, a majority the cause was fossil fuel corporations, which, and there's this ExxonMobil admittance recently, quite recently, that they actually know about climate change. They actually know what will happen. They predict in a very appropriate way that their action will cause climate change. But instead of addressing their culpability, they funded climate denialism. So that's why it is important that people understand that there are interests, there are powerful interests that block the global knowledge on climate change because they benefited from it. So our campaign is that when we talk about who will pay for climate loss and damages, who will pay, who will contribute, who should contribute in that pot that UN can use when countries were impacted by climate change. We also say corporations. Last year alone, the five top oil companies, BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Total, all these companies together actually earned $170 billion in their profits, and that was not tax. So this is connected to the campaign to have a windfall tax on these transnational corporations who are earning a lot also from destroying the environment of developing countries. And all these earnings are just distributed to their stock owners, just distributed to the board members, while the impacted communities get nothing. So so a part of that climate preparation, which is still under negotiation, when we say, for example, that the Annex 1 countries in the talks, the rich countries, will pay reparations to the South. So there's still that discussion, which may happen in the next 2 or 3 years. What will that look like? How will that look like? When we say that rich countries will pay the South, and there's an argument in many developing countries also that they're saying, well, we can't actually trust our governments to manage that, but that's another debate and another discussion, because countries, movements in South Africa, for example, was saying, look, many of the companies here are operating for centuries, and it's not owned by the government. The government has no control. So the question as well of how do we nationalize our energy? How do we nationalize these important companies? How do we make them follow regulations? How do we tax them? So these are part of the questions.
So, how can we ensure that the voices and perspectives of indigenous and minority communities are taken into account in the design and implementation of climate reparations?
Actually, that is an important question because if we would look as well, where are those? Who are the? Where are those? Coal plants, fossil fuel sites of operations are. Majority of them are in the lands of the indigenous peoples and indigenous community. So they are at the forefront of that climate change impacts. And in the in the setting up and operations of many of these highly polluting and environmentally damaging corporations, there were also that questions of land grabbing, territory grabbing of the lands and territories of indigenous people. So it is important that they are part of this process. In the UN level, the indigenous peoples are one of the important constituents of in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They were active in and actually are in the forefront of demanding climate reparations and also for the loss and damage as well. But it must be ensured that in the national level discussion, as the process of, for example, assessing loss and damage, uh, especially when there's a clear climate finance when there is a clear climate finance transfer from the developed to the developing countries, it must be important that in the national level or municipal level, provincial level, the indigenous and poor communities are part of that discussion. Because as I have mentioned earlier, in South Africa, many of the movements there were raising the questions this early that if there will be climate reparations and compensation, um, they are saying that, well, we don't know if we can trust our government because the government is very corrupt. So on one level, the government corruption is rampant, but it should not be used as an excuse by the rich and developed country to. I I don't have a blueprint how that happens because it must be a process that must be done on the global, national, and local level. How to involve, and so that means we must be a vanguard on on ensuring that that happens. In your case, SARIM, and of course many um sectors, institutions that are working with communities and people to ensure that the indigenous and poor communities are part of the discussion. And first and foremost, that they know this process that is happening. Because many communities, because they're not really following the results of climate negotiations, may not know that, oh, so that was agreed last year. So what does it have to do with me? So it is important that a very active, aggressive community and popular education is done so that people would know, oh, this affects me. I need to have my community's interest in this kind of discussions, and we should be part of this debate and discussions.
Absolutely. So you're talking about that our community needs an awareness. They have to be aware of what their problems are first of all, right? And they have to be awareness in terms of how they can actually challenge the decision makers within their circle or within their own country. Yeah, you said the example of South African government being corrupt because the people don't trust their government. So this
No,
is
no, that is from the social movements in
yeah,
South Africa. We should
absolutely.
not be accusing governments of being corrupt. Let their people accuse them of being.
Yeah, we're not the ones that we are accusing them, right? So
Yeah, because it also comes with I can rightly say the Philippine government is corrupt,
okay,
being a Filipino.
yeah, yeah. So how can we ensure that climate reparations are not used as an excuse to delay or avoid more comprehensive climate change mitigation and adaptation measures?
the question of climate change mitigation, actually, uh, there were past debates about it because if you remember when Kyoto Protocol was negotiated, and that is the the center discussion on mitigation, it is very clear that the rich countries are responsible for climate change and therefore they have to contribute to the climate finance. And it must be a fair share contribution to climate finance. But then the problem was the Kyoto Protocol have a lot of loopholes. So loopholes means there are many ways for the rich countries to actually avoid paying the responsibilities. That includes the introduction of market mechanisms, for example. So now much of the mitigation were being paid through carbon trading or being paid through clean development mechanisms, which were from the beginning already criticized by movements and NGOs, climate campaigners, for being distracting instead of uh, um, being progressive, because we know that, for example, clean development mechanism, there's nothing clean, there's nothing developmental in it. It's just a mechanism where there are double counting, where first and foremost, the targets are often the communities in the south, the targets for tree planting or the targets um, um, for those actions are in the south, and many of these actions do not actually address or minimize greenhouse emissions. When at the center of the discussion in the UNFCCC is how how can the highly emitting countries reduce their emissions? So in a way, mitigation actions were used by the rich how to avoid the responsibilities. So with loss and damage, it is clear that there are these losses, there are these damages, now pay. So a lesson for us in the history of mitigation, for example, is how do we avoid that this will not be handled or this will not be controlled by market mechanism? How do we ensure that it is the UN, whether it's a separate institution like UNEP or something like that, that will decide or will have the mandate to say where countries can go to and apply. Okay, there was a tsunami or there was a typhoon or monsoon rains that flooded my country. Now I assess 20 million damages. So where do they go to? So it is clear. It should be a more clearer mechanism, unlike in the case of mitigation and adaptation, where corporations have more say. Actually, many rich countries prefer the mitigation because that's where they can put their development mechanisms before. And that was also an important part of the negotiation last year in Egypt because they needed to review that and they needed to reform the mechanism. But sadly, clean development mechanism, even here in Europe, were seen as a failure. It has not reduced greenhouse gases. There were many questions in the way it was implemented. So we need to make sure that loss and damage will not follow that same history.
Absolutely. I mean, are they not really serious about climate change? The kind of perspective that you are giving me, the kind of information that you just gave us, basically, it's giving us the idea of those Western countries are not really interested in, on this issue. Would you like to comment on that? Because you talked about Kyoto Protocol as well. They've also violated Kyoto Protocol's prohibitions that or the recommendations that were set apart in the past.
Mm.
So is it about being not them not being serious, or they, as you also gave the example of those petroleum companies, those huge companies, they know about the climate change, but they close their eyes, right?
it's not about not not knowing. Actually, they know. Like in the case of all those fossil fuel companies, in the
Yeah.
case of the recent admission of ExxonMobil, they know it, but at the same time, they know that their money is coming from it,
Mhm.
and we also know that of course these are profiteering. Why will you kill the goose that laid the golden egg for
Mhm.
you if you're a company?
Yeah.
So it is to their interest to deny climate change. That's what they did for the last 40 years. They know climate change is happening, but they fund the denialism to it. So for
Mhm.
the rich countries, in terms of paying for compensation, that's why in the negotiation lasted this long, 27 negotiation. We have not seen a significant reduction on greenhouse gas emission. We have not seen serious move and action, appropriate action on climate finance, because at the end of the day, countries act on their national interest. So it is important to understand that national interest. Actually, when UN happens, in the past, I used when I've attended 8 negotiations and several I could not count anymore intersessional meetings. These are meetings in between the UN negotiations. When we arrive in a country and people see you with the ID, with the lanyard, people say, "Oh, you're here to save the planet." Well, the thing is, the climate negotiations is now far from just simply saving the planet, because the history of the COP is a history of delay. It's a history of distraction. It's a history of kicking the can down the road. It's the history of the powerful using their power to delay appropriate action and deny the global south appropriate action. So the question is, how do we change that kind of climate politics? How do we ensure that the global north, which, to be argued fairly, the rich countries have contributed 92% of global excess carbon emission. So it's time for them to pay up. It's time for them to reduce their emission. It's time for them to put their fair share and appropriate action, not actions that they are prepared to do. We've gone, we've gone beyond that. So it was the action that would actually are appropriate, and that means taxing their corporation. That means putting up more money in terms of their. This is another question, because some of those kind of finance are already in their aid finance as well. So how not to avoid double counting as well? Because many of the climate finance are double counted, and actually it should be separate. So how do we make that happen as well? So we are also talking about like uh, decade-long promises. Like in Copenhagen in 2009, there was that promise of 100 billion US dollar per year, and that is not happening yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll link that question with our second last question, with your detailed comment. So how can the international community support and collaborate with indigenous and minority communities in the implementation of climate reparations?
Well, first of course they should be on the table. They should be listened to. Their their indigenous knowledge should be recognized and respected and listened to. Uh, they can rightfully claim that they were the steward of the land where they lived. Because if we would look at the remaining sustainable rainforests, these are the territories where the indigenous people live. So their way of living is not as destructive as us who are non-indigenous. So it is important to have that acknowledgement and recognition. And also we also need to look ahead and ensure that they just don't have a seat in the table, that they're also part of uh, whatever team will be put up in terms of implementation. And how will the communities be represented? How will how will they be part of the key actors in the solutions? So in that argument of what we can do, first, well, stop harming the territories. Remove all those coal plants and oil plants that are destroying their territories, and then put them in charge of their alternative development that they wanted to pursue.
So yeah, first of all, they need to stop harming countries like us, and then we can basically negotiate with them on the table. So our last question would be regarding the impact. So how can we measure the impact of climate reparations on the well-being of indigenous and minority communities?
Yeah, that would be early to say now because it hasn't happened yet. There was no. First, there must be an international um, mechanism to put reparations, climate reparation, as a globally and legally binding um, steps or mechanisms. But what is also important here is that the climate negotiation is just one political arena, but the more important fight that we have is how can we ensure that outside the climate negotiation, we need to address the global economic, the global economy. How do we change the global economy to limit further climate breakdown? So I would now wanted to link it with global trade, global finance, the global economic order. We do need a new global economic order wherein trade will be in the way of climate change solutions. As we know now, for example, and this is also another campaign of Global Justice Now, when whatever government actions will be in place, the power of corporations is so much that they can actually stop all these actions by means of the investment state dispute settlement. Corporations have the power to sue governments when they think that their profits will be impacted. They have the power to sue, for example, if, say, what the Netherlands did. They said that by 2030, they will no longer have coal plants and will no longer use coal. Then uh, Uniper simply uh, put climate courts to work and sued the government of the Netherlands. So they can't do that. They can't just kick out coal companies. So how do we solve this? So that means solving the problem of unequal trade. So that's another process that will require the building of global social movements to make trade fair and actually work for people. So you also have the question of foreign debts. We know for a fact that many developing countries, there in our laws, there are those automatic appropriation of the national budget to debt repayment. As I mentioned earlier, in Pakistan, you need $40 billion to address the cause of the flooding last year. And your government would need to borrow money. So that means getting further indebted. And by paying all these debts, you lose money in the budget to put on education, to put on health, to put on other basic services. So the issue of debt cancellation, especially odious debt cancellation, should also be in the picture. Actually, the history of climate reparations also asks the question who owed what to whom. That the developing countries actually are the creditors here. That it's the North who owe the South to the history, by the history of colonialism. They actually owe the South to pay that debt of colonialism. So that's why it is not surprising that all this issue of reparations include the issue of slavery, colonization, climate damages. It has the history of industrialization, metabolic rift, climate destruction, biodiversity loss, and degradation of all planetary boundaries. So these are all connected issues.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for providing us your valuable
My
insight.
pleasure.
Uh, we were benefited from all of the knowledge that you just provided us. So, lastly, is there any message, or would you like to leave us with any comment for our viewers? Like any message?
Well, yeah, well, now here comes the promotion. You can go to our website, www.globaljusticenow.org.uk. You can support our campaigns on climate finance, on changing our trade by stopping corporate courts from being too powerful and corporations from being too powerful. We work actually together with many movements of peasants in Pakistan. All these are part of building consensus. And I think we look forward to also work with SARIM, where we can explore possibilities, how we can campaign together. Unfortunately, we don't fund projects because our work is more in campaigning. So we can very much extend all our research, all our briefing papers for free. It can be downloaded in our website and it can be used. It's a mix of policy kind of discourses. We also produce graphics, comics, how to make reparations very understandable. You can freely download our publication, translate it into various languages there in Pakistan. That's copy left. We will not you don't need to pay patents, intellectual property to us. When that happens, you can freely use our documents and analysis.
Thank you so much.